The sirens tore through the air, saturated with dust and smoke, vibrating between the skeletal remains of dead factories and the graffiti-stained buildings leaning like rotten giants beneath the grimy sky of Gary, Indiana, while the cold winds from Lake Michigan dragged scorched papers and fragments of a city that no longer breathed, only agonized, confined behind military barricades and barbed wire fences, abandoned even by those who once swore to defend it. Among these ruins walked Dr. Samuel Kepler, a man consumed by guilt and the fever of survival, his boots crushing shards of glass and empty shell casings, his face hidden behind an improvised mask, and his eyes red from sleepless nights, carrying in his backpack not hope, but a portable lab of broken promises, vials, reagents, syringes, instruments of a profession that failed to contain the monster it helped create. His footsteps echoed down the empty streets, interrupted only by the dragged laments hiding in alleyways, echoes of bodies that didn't yet know they were dead. Because the infection was treacherous, it didn't kill quickly. First came the fever, then paralysis, then delirium, until the body succumbed, silent, inert, like a puppet with cut strings. And everyone knew the name of that fate, the silence of Gary, because before dying, the infected lost their voice, as if the city itself demanded from them a final tribute of eternal silence. Samuel quickened his pace, crossing the old Broadway intersection, where traffic lights had frozen weeks ago in perpetual red, a mute warning that no one should cross anymore, until he reached the rusted entrance of the old subway, steps descending into a humid darkness where mold and fear mixed in the stale air. There, beneath tons of concrete, hid what was left of the community. 46 survivors huddled between dead tracks and decommissioned train cars, families who couldn't or wouldn't escape before the government sealed the city with explosives and landmines, condemning those left behind to a fate with no way out. Samuel descended, slowly hearing the dry coughs and broken whispers, feeling the hungry gaze of those who no longer believed in rescue, only in luck or death. Marta, a middle-aged woman, looked at him with hollow eyes and asked without hope, "Did you get anything?" And Samuel only shook his head, pulling from his backpack 3 vials of useless antibiotics, ridiculous palliatives against a pathogen that devoured body and soul, while someone whispered from the back, "The city's dead, and so are we," a sentence that hovered like poisonous gas over them all. Children curled under torn blankets, old people struggling to breathe, young ones staring into the cold void of the tracks. A blast echoed above, shaking dust from the ceiling and silencing the few murmurs. Samuel raised his eyes with a racing heart, and Marta, emotionless, simply said, "Demolition. They're isolating another sector." And he remembered the warning he'd heard on the radio 2 days ago, the metallic voice of the colonel. The city will be divided into eradication zones. The protocol is absolute. Eradicate to contain, and that word wouldn't leave his mind. Eradicate, as if they weren't lives anymore, but infections to be erased. He squeezed the vials like someone holding on to the last fragments of humanity, and muttered, "We need to get out of here," to which Marta gave a bitter laugh. Get out? There's nowhere to go. Samuel took a deep breath, remembering he wasn't just a survivor, but part of the disaster, one of the scientists who had created the foundation of that pathogen, a failure, an unexpected mutation, or a human error. No one knew for sure anymore. Only that he was now the last chance to delay the collapse. He climbed up again, determined to collect fresh samples. Each surface incursion was Russian roulette, never knowing if he'd find supplies, corpses, or infected in the final stages, those who, even without voice, still hunted any trace of life like broken but dangerous machines. He emerged onto the street, where the wind pushed dead leaves and plastic bags between abandoned and scorched cars, looted stores with mutilated mannequins in the windows, while starving rats fought over the remnants of what was once a living city. Samuel headed to the corner pharmacy, one of the few that still resisted looting, forced the door with a crowbar, and entered feeling. Along the empty shelves, grabbing what he could. Gauze, some sedatives, a broken inhaler, when he heard a cry, faint but unmistakable. He turned with the trembling flashlight and saw, between toppled boxes, a girl, no more than 8 years old, with scraped knees and wide, terrified eyes. Crying softly and hugging a battered backpack, Samuel approached slowly. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." But she didn't respond, just trembled. And when he touched her forehead, he felt it. Fever. Cold sweat dripping, the onset of infection. And he closed his eyes, crushed by the dilemma. If he took her to the subway, he could endanger everyone. If he left her, she would die alone, or worse, become one of the silent ones. But before he could rationalize, she grabbed his hand tightly, pleading without words for the chance to live, and Samuel lifted her into his arms, rushing out of the pharmacy, scanning both sides of the empty street, when he heard another sound, not a cry, but a dry grunt from the alley, and from there emerged a contorted figure, pale skin, empty eyes. A final stage infected, staggering but fast upon sensing Samuel's presence, who ran, clutching the girl to his chest, descending the subway steps shouting, "Open up! Open the gate!" And down below Marta and others rushed to unlock the improvised barricade. Samuel passed through, followed by a brutal impact, the infected hurling itself against the bars, scratching the metal with broken nails, while inside everyone watched, silently, that creature that had once been human, now reduced to a mechanical, lethal instinct. Samuel set the girl down. She moaned, delirious. Marta approached, looking at the evident fever, then at Samuel and asked with surgical coldness, "Is she infected?" But he didn't answer, only stared at the infected on the other side of the gate, still writhing like a caged animal, while in the background the demolition sirens sounded again, announcing that yet another sector of the city would soon be eradicated, and their time was running out. Before the sirens, before the barricades, and the stench of burnt flesh permeated the wind, there was only the monotonous sound of machines in the city's underground laboratory, where Dr. Samuel Kepler spent hours absorbed in petri dishes and cell cultures, unaware that every drop he handled, every genetic sequence he altered, was a silent step toward collapse. And now, sitting at the bottom of the cold, damp subway, surrounded by feverish bodies and desperate eyes, he couldn't shake the memory of that specific day, just over a month ago, when the biological alarm first sounded, faint, almost imperceptible. A technical error, they said, a false positive, repeated so many times over the years that no one took it seriously anymore. But not this time, not then. And Samuel remembered with surgical clarity the computer screen flashing red, uncatalogued mutation, while behind him his colleagues continued debating procedures, too busy to notice the exact moment when the future of the entire city split in two. He ignored it too at the time, absorbed by reports and the constant pressure from the military who funded the project. An immune serum capable of neutralizing pathogens in the field, a defense for soldiers in biological conflict zones, a noble idea transformed into mercantile. Urgency deadlines, tightened guarantees ignored until the mutation slipped through containment filters and spread first among technicians. Then maintenance workers, silent, stealthy, with no clear symptoms in the early hours, an intelligent virus, adapted, or perhaps just a reflection of human recklessness. And by the time they realized, it was already too late. For the oldest and most brutal protocol: isolate the city, cut all routes, lock everyone inside a ring of steel and fire. Samuel closed his eyes and could still hear the roar of helicopters descending, soldiers in pressurized suits shouting orders for civilians to return to their homes, while he, with his scientist badge, was authorized to circulate freely for a while, desperately trying to synthesize a response, an antidote, anything. But the virus kept evolving with each collected sample, as if it were learning, as if it were mocking every attempt to contain its spread. He remembered running through already deserted streets, passing neighbors huddled behind locked doors, while bodies began to appear on sidewalks, folded in impossible angles, cold skin, eyes open but empty, and no one spoke anymore. Only cried or moaned until the silence became complete, the same silence now dominating the subway, except for the groans of the feverish girl he had rescued hours earlier from the pharmacy. And Samuel looked at her, seeing not just a child on the brink of death, but the symbol of everything they had lost: innocence, trust in science, in humanity, and perhaps even in himself. He ran his hands over his face, feeling the rough beard and coarse skin, while the next memory cut through him like a blade: the last meeting at the lab, when the military decided the risk was uncontrollable and ordered the total shutdown of the facilities, abandoning all active containment protocols and declaring the city lost. And it was in that moment that Samuel made the decision that now condemned him. He refused to evacuate, even when he had the chance, even when the helicopter was right there, its blades spinning and the pilot shouting for him to get on board. He stayed not out of heroism, but from a desperate need to try to fix what he had broken, as if he could with his own hands reverse the fate of the entire city. And then came the collapse. Hospitals overflowing with apathetic patients, schools empty, supermarkets looted, and streets overtaken by the sound of sirens, demolitions, silent executions of final stage infected, who are no longer seen as people, but as walking biological threats. Samuel still felt on his skin the heat of the explosions when the military destroyed the central district. Trying to contain the advance, a futile attempt to establish containment lines in a city already lost, while he sought refuge in the subway, initially alone until others began to arrive. Families escaping eradication zones, youths fleeing soldiers, old men carried on improvised carts. And soon they formed a fragile and silent community, united only by the brute necessity to survive. Samuel found himself, without realizing it, transformed from scientist to informal leader, the only one with any technical knowledge, the only one still daring to go out in search of supplies or new samples, even knowing that each incursion brought him closer to an inevitable end. And now sitting there, listening to the muffled grunts of the infected trapped on the other side of the gate, while the girl's body burned with fever, just meters away, he wondered when exactly the line between man and monster had blurred. If he was still a scientist, or just another survivor trying to cheat death for a few more hours. Up above, new demolition sirens began to sound, indicating that yet another sector of the city would be eradicated before dawn. And Samuel slowly stood up, grabbing his backpack, the empty vials, and looking one last time at the silent community that depended on him, before climbing once again the steps of hell, knowing that each time he emerged, he left behind more than just the fetid air of the subway. He left pieces of himself, of his humanity, while the contagion, invisible and relentless, continued to devour the city street by street, corner by corner, until soon there would be no one left to remember that here, in this forgotten place, there was once a city called Gary. They have less than 6 hours before the army blows everything up, and there's no rescue, no mercy, no easy way out. Now, every second decides who lives, and who will be buried beneath the rubble of the dead city. In this devastating conclusion, you will witness how far a human being can go to survive, and the terrible price paid when there is no hope left. The cold cut like invisible blades as Dr. Samuel Kepler climbed the cracked concrete steps, feeling every muscle protest, every breath weigh like lead in his lungs. But he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the last sector of the city was about to be eradicated. And above him, the sky over Gary, gray and oppressive, seemed to collapse into dust and smoke, while the sirens screamed like ghosts from a time that no longer existed, announcing that the explosive charges were ready, that yet another part of the city would be reduced to rubble, that more lives, or what was left of them, would be buried under tons of concrete. Samuel clutched the backpack to his chest, where he kept the last collected samples, not because he truly believed, There was still time or resources to synthesize a cure, but because he needed to hold on to something, anything that would keep him climbing, keep him fighting even as everything around him imploded, even as the city, like a terminal organism, expelled its final breaths of resistance. He slipped through the deserted streets where leaning lampposts cast long, distorted shadows over bodies left forgotten, while the wind dragged dead leaves and fragments of torn posters, advertising a vaccination campaign that never happened. A cruel irony Samuel ignored as he approached the abandoned hospital, a colossal building that had once been a symbol of hope and now rotted under the weight of silence and death. He pushed the emergency door, feeling the rust give way with an agonized groan, and entered, groping through the dark corridors, dodging toppled stretchers and wheelchairs covered in dust, until he reached the old analysis lab, where he knew he could still find what he needed: reagents, catalysts, equipment that hadn't been looted or destroyed. And with trembling hands, he began to set up an improvised station, ignoring the fact that outside, every additional second meant greater risk, ignoring the muffled scream of instinct pleading for him to run, focusing only on the meticulous sequence of movements his scientific mind could still execute. He drew a sample of his own blood, mixed it with the material collected from the girl, and observed under the microscope's cold lens what he already feared. The pathogen kept mutating, resisting, expanding like an intelligent cancer, blocking every attempt at neutralization with monstrous efficiency, and for the first time since it all began. Samuel allowed a tear to cut down his dirty face, not out of fear, but from a brutal, definitive understanding. There was no cure, there never was, and everything they'd done from the start had only delayed the inevitable, masked the collapse of a species that played too much with forces it didn't understand. He wiped his face angrily, packed the samples and the few useful vials in the backpack, and left, the hospital running through the crumbling streets, while in the distance, he heard the dry sound of the demolitions beginning the blasts, reverberating through hollow walls, the clouds of dust rising like mushrooms of death. And he knew he had to return, had to warn the others, had to. But he stopped abruptly when he turned the corner and faced a group of soldiers, armed, their pressurized suits gleaming under the dim twilight. And before he could react, one of them shouted, "Stop! Identify yourself!" And Samuel raised his hands, showing the dirty scientist badge, while trying to explain that there were survivors hiding in the subway, that there were still people alive down there, that they couldn't blow everything up. But the officer, eyes hidden behind the mirrored visor, only responded with the coldness of someone who no longer sees human beings, only vectors of contamination. Orders are orders. The entire city will be eradicated by dawn. And then they turned away, as if Samuel were just another useless shadow in that landscape of ruins. He stood there for one interminable second, feeling the ground tremble beneath his feet with yet another distant detonation, until he ran like he had never run before, descending back into the subway, shouting through the damp corridors until he found Marta and the others, who gathered around him with wide eyes as he, breathless, explained between sobs that they had less than 6 hours before the army detonated everything, that there were no more rescues, no more containment lines, only the certainty that if they stayed, they would be buried alive there. The silence that followed was absolute, until Marta, with a hoarse voice, asked, "And the antidote?" To which Samuel only shook his head, unable to lie, and then she looked at the children, at the old people, at the few young ones who still had strength, and murmured, "Then all we have left is to try." And so, in a matter of minutes, they began gathering what little they had: torn backpacks, water bottles, pieces of moldy bread, and followed Samuel through the dark tunnels, guided only by the weak flashlight and the faint hope of finding an exit, a passage, anything that would take them beyond the deadly limits of Gary. They moved in silence, hearing only their own footsteps and the distant clatter of the last demolitions, until they reached the old maintenance tunnel. Samuel vaguely remembered from studying the city's underground maps a tunnel that theoretically led to the lake's edge, beyond the military perimeter. With no other option, they entered, crawling between rubble and hanging electrical wires, ignoring the acrid smell of mold and death, until, after hours of painful progress, they spotted the faint light filtering through the corroded grates marking the tunnel's end. Samuel forced the grate with all his strength, while the others pushed beside him until, with a metallic snap, it gave way, and suddenly they were on the other side, breathing the lake's cold air, free, or at least as free as one can be, when behind them an entire city is being buried alive. They looked back for a moment, seeing the columns of smoke and the explosions painting the night sky with the disaster as final signature. And then they moved forward, walking along the rocky shore, not knowing where to, not knowing if there was a world out there that could still receive them, but certain of one thing, that they had survived, that they had crossed through hell, and left behind not just a dead city, but also a part of themselves. And as they walked silent, Samuel clutched the backpack with the last samples, knowing that even if they never served any purpose, they were the final testimony that here, in this forgotten place, men and women fought till the very last second against something greater than they could comprehend. And yet, they chose not to surrender. And so, as the city of Gary was reduced to dust, they moved on, not as heroes, but as survivors forever marked. If you believe that even in the worst catastrophes humanity can find the strength to resist, share this video and leave a comment. Would you have the courage to cross through hell? Or would you accept the end? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of extreme survival like this, where the human limit is tested and not everyone makes